Okay, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're doing something a little different. We're not just diving into a topic, we're diving into a mind.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, we've got this stack of sources here, and they look like everything from, very personal reflections and notes to really intense literary criticism and wide-ranging philosophical explorations, all from the same author.
Wow. So it's truly a chance to see the world through his eyes, I suppose,
Hmm.
to understand not just what he thought, but maybe how he thought, his struggles, his insights.
Exactly. And these materials, they cover so much ground, deep dives into poetry, complex philosophy, travel stuff, and just very human stories.
Sounds like a lot to unpack.
It is. So our mission for this deep dive is basically to sift through all this rich, sometimes, let's be honest, challenging material.
Right.
We want to pull out the most important insights, the, surprising details, the stuff that makes you think, give you a curated look at this fascinating individual's perspective.
So blending the literary, the philosophical, and the kind of the personal side of things.
That's the plan. We're going to try and weave it all together.
Okay, let's get started then.
Let's do it. So first off, these sources give us a real sense of the author's life and character right from the start.
How so?
Well, he paints this picture of himself pretty vividly, actually, as an orphan with, few connections. He talks about his friendless wanderings in London.
That sense of isolation. It sounds like it might have been quite profound for him.
It seems that way. And he also shares memories from school, particularly one old master who had very strong opinions about language.
Oh, yeah. What kind of opinions?
Well, apparently this master found things like lute, harp, and lyre an abomination. Just hated it.
Really? An abomination. Strong word.
Totally. He preferred sound good sense and plainer words. Apparently, he even kept a list of words he banned. You get this image of him, kind of stern, saying, "Muse, boy, muse. You're a nurse's daughter, you mean?"
Huh. Okay, so that sets up this early tension, doesn't it? Between fancy language and grounded meaning, which seems to pop up later in his own writing.
Exactly. And his early life choices, well, they led to big decisions, like leaving Cambridge.
Right. And then facing the reality of trying to make a living as what he calls a mere literary man, just totally dependent on book sales.
And the sources are quite pointed about this. He argues pretty strongly that even a genius needs a profession. Some stable job that isn't just based on...
Whether you feel inspired that day or if you're healthy enough to write.
Precisely. It gives you a necessary foundation, he thinks. Stability?
Yeah, stability. He actually lists examples, doesn't he? Like Cicero, Xenophon, Bacon, even contemporaries like Darwin and Roscoe.
All people who did weighty, important work and had independent jobs.
Right. And he contrasts that with the mere literary man who he feels kind of lacks that connection to the real world. Maybe he doesn't have the knack for what ordinary people care about.
You really see this struggle in his own experience, especially publishing The Friend. He talks about the nightmare with subscribers.
Oh, yeah, like that lord who kept getting the pamphlets but then claimed he didn't know anything about it.
Exactly. Total nightmare. And based on this, he gives this really strong warning, basically saying, look, don't deviate from the normal way of publishing through the trade. Just don't.
It sounds like hard-won advice. And there's that other story, too, the slightly dark but funny one.
Which one?
About the elderly clergyman who published his new theory of redemption himself.
Oh, right. At his own expense.
Only to find copies later being used as, waste paper.
Yeah, he tells it with a bit of humor, but man, it really highlights the risks involved.
Definitely. And he even mentions early health issues. Something about tobacco.
Yeah, a giddiness from tobacco that apparently messed up an early engagement. Just these little human details.
And despite all the trouble getting subscribers going, the sources do mention people being kind to him in different towns.
That's true. It's a nice touch, isn't it? Amidst all the financial stress.
It really paints a fuller picture of the person, not just the intellect.
Which kind of brings us nicely to the literary world, where he obviously spent so much time thinking and writing. And it's fascinating how he talks about critics.
How so? What's his take?
Well, get this. He claims he owes full 2/3 of whatever reputation and publicity he has to anonymous critics and satirists.
Wow. Yeah. That's quite something. Is that a compliment or just pure cynicism?
Hard to tell, right? But he definitely doesn't pull punches. He calls a lot of it literary detraction and moral slander.
Ouch.
Yeah. Coming from what he calls scribblers from idleness and ignorance, who then become libelers from envy. He clearly had zero time for anonymous attacks. Reasoned argument. Okay. Anonymous potshots, no.
Makes sense. Now, didn't he plan some big lecture series on poetry?
He did, yeah.
Hmm?
Originally wanted to cover everything, like Chaucer right up to his own
But
time.
he changed his mind.
Yeah, he decided to limit it.
Yeah.
Focus on the earlier periods, like Chaucer to Milton, and then Dryden to Thomson.
Why'd the change?
He says specifically it was to avoid being misunderstood or having his comments twisted and applied to contemporary poets he maybe didn't want to offend directly. He wanted to discuss principles using historical examples, keep it less personal maybe.
Oh, okay. Safer ground.
Yeah,
And his views on poetic style itself. You mentioned he had strong opinions.
very sharp. He really critiques what he calls translations of prose thoughts into poetic language.
Meaning?
Basically, just taking boring, everyday ideas and sticking fancy poetic words on them. He calls it the false beauty of the moderns.
So style over substance, essentially.
Pretty much. And he contrasts this with older poets like Donne or Cowley. He says they might have had fantastic out-of-the-way thoughts, really weird ideas sometimes, but they express them in pure and genuine Mother English. Simple, direct language for complex thoughts.
Whereas the moderns, in his view, did the opposite.
Exactly. Most obvious thoughts in language, the most fantastic and arbitrary. All dressed up with nowhere to go, kind of.
Interesting distinction. Did he see anyone breaking that modern trend?
Yeah, he gives credit to Cowper and Bowles, says they were among the first of his time to really combine natural thoughts with natural diction.
Reconciling the heart with the head, as he put it.
That's the phrase. And he's honest about himself, too, admits that when he was young, he also fell into using laborious and florid diction before, he learned better.
Huh. Self-awareness there. But the part that really jumps out in the sources is his deep dive into Wordsworth, Mr. Wordsworth's poems and theories.
Oh, definitely. He believed that a lot of the opposition to Wordsworth came directly from those critical remarks Wordsworth himself put in the preface to Lyrical Ballads.
Right, and he really digs into Wordsworth's big theory, the one about poetry's language coming from low and rustic life.
Yeah, he takes that on directly, offers several counter-arguments, starting with just practical stuff.
Like what?
Well, first, he says, look, actual rustic language isn't pure. It needs cleaning up grammar, weird local words, provincialisms.
Okay, fair point.
And he also says, educated language isn't automatically artificial. Both educated speech and rustic speech involve leaving out certain peculiarities to be understood widely.
So both are kind of stylized in their own way.
Sort of, but his more fundamental point is about the content of poetry. He argues that a lot of poetic language uses symbols for complex inner thoughts, feelings, states of mind.
Things that just aren't really part of an uneducated person's conscious experience or vocabulary.
Exactly. And he says, quite bluntly actually, that the language, even in Wordsworth's own supposedly simple poems, his homeliest composition, is still very different from how a real peasant talks.
So what term does he think is better, if not rustic?
He suggests ordinary or lingua communis. Just, common language, accessible language, not specifically rustic.
Got it. And he also pushes back against the idea that the best poetry should sound just like good prose, right?
Totally. He argues that poetry and prose are fundamentally different and that this unfitness of each for the place of the other frequently will and ought to exist. They shouldn't be interchangeable.
Which leads him into talking about meter, the rhythm and structure of poetry.
Yes. He sees meter as doing something really important, bringing a union, an interpenetration of passion and of will. It's not just decoration.
So what does it do?
He thinks meter actually justifies using more picturesque and vivifying language in poetry. It's like a deal, a tacit compact with the reader. You accept the meter, you get richer language.
He uses that analogy, doesn't he? Meter is like yeast.
Yeah. Worthless on its own, maybe, but it gives life and energy, vivacity to the whole thing.
That's a great analogy. And he uses specific examples from Wordsworth to back this up.
Oh, yeah. Lines from the famous Immortality Ode, The Mad Mother, even The Idiot Boy. He uses them to make his points.
Does he admire Wordsworth overall?
Very much so, in parts. He shows real admiration for passages that show depth, elevated thinking, but he contrasts those with others that seem, to him, mainly there just to prove the rustic theory, and maybe fall a bit flat.
So a nuanced critique.
Definitely. And it leads him to argue strongly against seeing Wordsworth as just some sweet, simple poet. He insists on Wordsworth's philosophical depth, which is where we get that really famous line.
Let me guess. No man was ever yet a great poet without being at the same time a profound philosopher.
That's the one. Linking great poetry directly to deep thinking.
A powerful claim. And he wasn't afraid to criticize the critics either, was he? The establishment.
Not at all. He specifically names the Edinburgh Review, calls them out for bias, for deciding beforehand that something won't do. That attitude.
So he preferred reasoned arguments, not just dismissals.
Absolutely. He wanted engagement, not just anonymous abuse.
And he applied this kind of deep analysis to older writers, too, like Shakespeare.
Yep. He looks at Venus and Adonis and Rape of Lucrece, calls them examples of pure poetic power.
What does he focus on there?
Shakespeare's incredible ability to portray feeling, character, almost intuitively, his use of imagery, and again, that combination of depth and energy of thought. Shakespeare is firmly in that poet-philosopher category for him.
Makes sense. And he turns that same critical eye on the drama of his own time.
He does. He's pretty scathing about modern tragedies, especially by Kotzebue in this play called Bertram. Finds them totally lacking compared to Shakespeare or even Molière.
Why? What's missing for him?
Authenticity, mainly. He prefers characters that feel like a natural growth of the human mind, not these like sensationalized villains or abstract ideas like Don Juan.
So more psychological depth, less melodrama.
Exactly. He really tears into Bertram, points out specific things. A storm that makes no sense, characters with unbelievable motives, actions that feel totally forced, and just relying on cheap tricks, super tragic starts, pauses, screams.
Sounds like he found it pretty shallow.
Very. And he was particularly bothered by some controversial scene involving a high altar. His critique isn't just nitpicking, it's arguing that this kind of play is a sign of decline, chasing thrills instead of real human insight.
That sets a high bar.
Okay, so moving on from literature. The sources also dive deep into philosophy, right? He discusses various systems. Yeah, he runs through quite a few.
Yeah.
Dualism like Descartes' harmonia prestabilita from Spinoza and Leibniz, hylozoism, materialism.
A whole tour of philosophical options and his conclusion.
Basically that none of them, not even the association theory by itself, can really explain perception, how we actually experience the world, or how our minds link ideas together, form the associable, as he calls it.
So he digs into that law of association.
He does, compares Aristotle's ideas recall each other just by being close in time or space with Hartley's theory.
Hartley's was the one with physical vibrations in the brain, right?
Yeah, and he argues against Hartley. Says it's illogical. How could different initial experiences possibly produce the exact same physical vibration later on? It doesn't add up for him.
Okay, and this is where we get that really strange, fascinating story. The anecdote.
Oh, the Hebrew maid. Yes,
Yeah.
It's incredible. This young woman, in a nervous fever, starts speaking Hebrew and rabbinical dialects fluently.
But she didn't consciously know those languages.
Not at all. Turns out, years before, she'd worked for a pastor who used to walk around his study reading aloud from his Hebrew and rabbinical books. She just overheard it, didn't understand a word consciously.
Wow. So it was all stored away somewhere.
That's his point. He uses it as evidence for this really profound idea that all thoughts are in themselves imperishable.
Imperishable, meaning they never truly disappear.
Yeah. He suggests it points to some deeper level of memory, maybe even hinting that we could potentially access collective past experiences. He calls memory the dread book of judgment. It's quite a mystical thought.
Speaking of mystical, he talks about his influences, including mystics.
He's very open about it,
Yeah.
mentions his debt to people like Bayman, Thallerus, George Fox, acknowledges their ideas can sometimes edge towards pantheism.
The idea that God is everything and everything is God.
Right. But he feels strongly their core insights are compatible with religion. He expresses particular gratitude towards Bayman. Seems he found something really valuable there.
But the biggest philosophical influence he mentions is Kant, right?
Oh, absolutely. Immanuel Kant, he calls him the illustrious sage of Königsberg, says Kant's writings at once invigorated and disciplined my understanding. Huge impact. He sees Kant as the founder of the critical philosophy.
And this connection to Kant leads to what he considers a really crucial distinction, something central to his own work, The Friend.
Yes. The distinction between the reason and the understanding. He says getting this right is vital.
Okay, break that down. What's the difference for him? It sounds important.
It really is. So the understanding for him is the part of our mind that deals with the outside world, with information coming through our senses. It's logical, analytical, it classifies things, draws conclusions from data. Think of it like the mind's computer processing input.
Okay, the logical, sense-based part. What about reason?
Reason is higher. It's the source of truths that don't come from sense experience. Things like fundamental moral laws, the idea of God, universal principles. It's intuitive, it sees the big picture, the wholeness of things.
So understanding works with the world the senses give it, while reason grasps truths beyond the senses.
Exactly. The understanding analyzes the given. The reason apprehends the transcendent. He calls this distinction an indispensable condition of all sound speculation. In metaphysics, ethics, theology, it's foundational.
Wow. Okay, that's a big idea. And based on this, he asks that tough question. Is philosophy possible as a science?
Right. And he uses geometry as an analogy.
How does that work?
Well, geometry works as a science because it starts with something clear you can picture outwardly, an intuition, like a line or a point.
Okay.
But philosophy, he argues, has to start with an intuition of the inner sense, our own consciousness.
And the problem is,
Yeah,
you can't draw consciousness on a blackboard like you can draw a line.
precisely. Philosophy lacks those outward corresponding pictures, which is why, he says, you need something else. He calls it a philosophic organ.
A philosophic organ, like a special faculty for understanding philosophy?
Yeah. He thinks you need this specific ability to perceive philosophical truths directly. Without it, he says, trying to grasp philosophy is like a deaf person trying to understand music, or a blind person trying to understand geometry.
So it's not just about being smart, it's about having the right kind of inner perception.
That's his argument. Otherwise, philosophy just becomes a play of words and notions, totally groundless and hollow, just intellectual games.
Intense. And what is philosophy searching for, in his view?
An absolute truth. Something completely self-grounded, unconditional, and known by its own light.
Something that's true just because it is, not dependent on anything else.
Exactly. Somewhat which is, simply because it is. Unlike scientific truths, which depend on things existing in the world.
And where does he think we find this absolute truth?
Internally, in the act and evolution of self-consciousness. By understanding our own being, our own awareness, we grasp something fundamental.
That sounds almost religious.
He connects it directly. Says metaphysics is nothing else but true divinity. He sees this whole philosophical quest, the drive to know thyself, nathi satan, as a fundamental, almost spiritual instinct in us. He thinks speculation will always continue because of it.
And he mentions other philosophers who came after Kant.
Yeah, Fichte and Schelling says they tried to complete Kant's system. He specifically notes his debt to Schelling, especially for founding the philosophy of nature.
Okay, quite a philosophical journey there. Now let's totally shift gears because the sources also include travel writing.
They do, from abstract thought right down to concrete experience. He gives us this narrative of his journey, starting from Cuxhaven, going up the Elbe to Hamburg.
What's it like?
He describes the scenery, the spire steeples along the river, the trees, the little villages. Pretty evocative.
And he's had that interesting thought about the spire steeples themselves, doesn't he?
Yeah. There's symbolism pointing skyward, but he contrasts how they look in flat country versus mountains.
Right. In flat country, they draw your eye up, but in the mountains.
He thought they looked mean but ludicrous, like little candle extinguishers, totally dwarfed by the huge peaks around them. It's a specific observation.
And arriving in Hamburg, what does he notice?
Details about the boat he was on, the cargo, the other passengers, just observing people and things.
And the city itself, Hamburg.
He notes the mix of English and Dutch influences, the sounds, lots of bells, the sights, people everywhere, drinking coffee, playing cards, smoking pipes.
And he makes that rather blunt observation about the women.
Oh, yeah. Contrasting the city women in English dresses, all rouged and all with bad teeth.
Ouch.
With the country women who had, he says, this mother of pearl whiteness. It's certainly a candid observation from the time.
Definitely a product of its time. There's also that encounter with a French gentleman.
Yes, it's a lovely little anecdote. He tries to define what makes a gentleman, saying it's more felt than defined. Involves minute philanthropy, sort of small kindnesses, and being sober without being standoffish.
And he contrasts this with French and Anglo-American characters.
He does. And he recounts this brief, very polite disagreement they had about French poetry. The Frenchman's response was apparently very graceful.
And the author felt?
He admits quite humbly that maybe he didn't handle his side of it quite as well. It's a nice moment of self-reflection.
And then there's the big meeting with the famous poet Klopstock and Radsberg.
Right. Big deal for him, though he admits, again, quite honestly, that he was initially a bit disappointed.
Disappointed? Why?
Klopstock's actual appearance didn't quite match the bust he'd seen. And he notes physical details, like Klopstock having swollen legs, just very human observations.
What does he talk about?
The sources give quite a bit of detail. Klopstock's age, his prose translation of Milton's Paradise Lost, which our author didn't seem too keen on.
What else?
Klopstock's views on translating Greek poetry into English verse. Apparently, Klopstock was really proud of the plan behind his own odes on the French Revolution, maybe more than the execution.
Interesting. Did they discuss other writers?
Yeah, Klopstock shared opinions on Horace, Rousseau, but apparently his knowledge of English poets was pretty limited, just Milton and Dryden, really.
What about German writers? Goethe, Schiller.
Klopstock thought Goethe's best work was Werther, and for Schiller, he picked Don Carlos as the best drama, but found the plot totally inextricable, confusing. Added that Schiller couldn't live, maybe meaning he lacked some essential spark or vitality. Hard to say for sure.
And they talk technical stuff too, like meter.
English, meter, and rhyme. And Klopstock had this idea about borrowing idioms between languages.
What did our author think of that?
He thought it was dangerous. Cited Milton as someone who sometimes weakened his English by doing that too much.
It really gives you a snapshot of the literary conversations happening back then, and a very personal glimpse of meeting a major figure.
Totally. So, looking back over all this stuff, what really strikes you, it's the incredible range, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, from deep literary theory and complex philosophy all the way down to, struggles making rent and observations about church steeples.
It's a mind just constantly wrestling with big questions. What is good poetry? Where does knowledge come from? How do you live a thoughtful life in a messy world?
Definitely. And he saw religion playing a key role in morality, didn't he? The cornerstone and the keystone needing a moral origin. He grappled with doctrines like the incarnation and redemption, but always seemed to approach them through reason and morality.
The sources also give us glimpses of the political backdrop. He describes his own stance like anti-government, but also anti-revolutionary, anti-Jacobin.
Right. His views on the war, on subsidizing allies. And he mentions being warned by pretty high-up people like Baron von Humboldt and Cardinal Fesch.
Warned about what?
About Napoleon. Apparently Bonaparte was pretty ticked off about things he'd written in the Morning Post newspaper.
Wow. That adds a layer of danger. And didn't he get mistaken for a spy at one point?
Yeah, because he was carrying maps or something. Slightly alarming experience, I imagine.
No kidding. And running through all of it, there's this strong undercurrent about the value of hard thinking, isn't there? What he calls intellectual industry.
He really defends the effort involved, argues that the elaborate products of his intellect deserve his protection almost as much as his moral character does, justifies defending himself against slander because of the sheer work put in.
He notes somewhere that he seldom wrote in a single day what hadn't already cost him a month's worth of thinking and preparation.
Yeah, it really underscores his belief in that difficult but absolutely essential task of thinking clearly. Trying to separate real insight from just superficial noise, whether that's in philosophy or poetry or anywhere else.
Which feels incredibly relevant now, doesn't it?
Absolutely. If you connect all these threads, his hunt for absolute truth, that vital distinction he makes between understanding and reason, his call for a philosophic organ, it speaks directly to our time. We're just swimming in information, constantly bombarded with what he might call those plays of words and notions.
It really raises a crucial question, I think, for you listening. Given the depth and frankly the struggle this author faced in seeking true understanding, how do you approach the task of knowing today?
Yeah, I mean, not just collecting facts, right? But really grappling with ideas.
In a world that feels like total information overload sometimes, how do you cultivate that inner capacity, that philosophic organ, as he might put it? How do you sharpen your ability to tell the difference between just words, just noise, and genuine insight?
Something to think about.
Definitely something to carry with you as you navigate your own deep dives into the world. Thanks for joining us.